He was just a boy, really. 17 years old. His name was Harold Sigurdsson. Later, the world would know him as Hardrada, the Hard Ruler. But in 1030, he was just a teenager bleeding in the grass at the Battle of Stiklestad. He fought for his half-brother, King Olaf II of Norway, and he watched his brother die. Harald, badly wounded, was dragged from the field by a friend and hidden on a remote farm. He was a fugitive, an outcast prince with nothing but a name and a grudge. He made his way east, across the mountains of Norway, through Sweden. He found his way to the great river roads, the domain of the Rus. He ended up in Kiev at the court of Yaroslav the Wise. For a few years, he served the Grand Prince, leading his men in campaigns. He learned the ways of the East. He learned how to command. But Kiev wasn't big enough. The stories he heard were all of the south. They spoke of a city so grand it was simply called Miklagard, the Great City. Constantinople, and they spoke of the Emperor's Guard, the Varangians, men from the north like him who served the ruler of the Romans and became rich beyond belief. Around 1034, Harald and his 500 followers arrived in the great city. He was tall, strong, and carried the aura of a fallen prince. He enrolled in the Varangian Guard. He was not just another axe for hire. He was royalty. The Byzantines saw this. They gave him command. He fought for them in the Mediterranean against pirates. He fought in Sicily, helping the General George Maniakes reclaim the island for the empire. He was good at it, brutally good. He knew how to fight, and he knew how to lead. He fought in Bulgaria, helping to crush a major revolt in 1041. His reputation grew. So did his wealth. The pay was good, but the real money was in plunder. After a city was taken, the Varangians had the right to Polutasvarf, to go through the palace of the defeated ruler and take whatever they could carry. Harald was a master of this. He was clever. He sent his wealth north, back to Yaroslav the Wise in Kiev for safekeeping. Gold, jewels, precious silks, a river of treasure flowed from the battlefields of the south to the vaults of the north, all in Harold's name. The sagas say he gathered more wealth than any Norseman had ever seen. He also became entangled in the deadly politics of the Byzantine court. Emperors rose and fell. Harold was there in 1042 when the unpopular Emperor Michael V was overthrown. The sagas claim it was Harold himself who led the men into the palace and personally blinded the deposed emperor. It was a messy, brutal business. Soon after, he fell out of favor with the new rulers. They imprisoned him. They wanted his fortune, but Harold was not a man to be caged. He escaped. He and a few followers seized a boat, rowed across the Golden Horn, and cut the great chain that blocked the harbor. They sailed their ship out into the Black Sea and didn't look back. He returned to Kiev a wealthy man. The boy who fled a battlefield with nothing was now a seasoned commander with a king's ransom. He used that Byzantine gold to fund his ambition. He married Yaroslav's daughter, Elizabeth. He returned to Norway in 1046, no longer a fugitive, but a threat. The fortune he earned in Miklagard was his weapon. He forced his nephew, the current king, to make him co-ruler. A year later, his nephew was dead, and Harald Hardrada was the sole king of Norway. He had turned Byzantine gold into a Norwegian throne. But the stories he carried, the things he saw in the marble halls and dusty battlefields of the south, were his own. Many of them he took to his grave when he died, years later, on a battlefield in England. Like all Varangians, he left behind more secrets than stories. Number 17, the last stand at Dyrrhachium, was a matter of honor, not orders. It was 1081. The man's name was Hrafn. He was from Iceland. He had been in the guard for 10 years. He had seen 2 emperors come and go. He thought he knew war. He had fought Pechenegs on the Danube. He had fought Seljuks in Anatolia. He was a veteran. He carried an axe that was older than some of the new recruits. He stood now on the coast of what is now Albania. The city was Dyrrhachium. The enemy was new. They were Normans, led by a man named Robert Guiscard. Men from the north, just like the Varangians. But they were here to break the empire, not serve it. The Emperor Alexios I Komnenos was young. He was clever, but this was his first major test, and he drew up his army. The Varangians were on the right flank, far forward. It was a place of honor. It was also a place of extreme danger. The veterans like Raffen knew what this meant. They were the anchor. They were expected to hold, no matter what. Before the battle, their commander, a man named Nampites, spoke to them. He did not speak of the emperor's grand strategy. He did not speak of Byzantine glory. He spoke to them in their own tongue. He reminded them of their oaths. Not just the oath to the emperor. He spoke of the oath to the man standing next to them. The battle began. The Norman charge on the other flank broke the Byzantine lines. The mercenaries, Serbs, and Turks fled. The left wing of the imperial army crumbled. Soon the center followed. Panic set in. The great Byzantine army was dissolving. But the right flank did not break. The Varangians stood their ground. Hraffen saw the army running. He saw the emperor's banner retreating. He knew, logically, that the battle was lost. The sensible thing to do was to pull back, to retreat in good order and save themselves. But they had been given a post. No order came to leave it. The Normans, having routed the rest of the army, turned their full attention to the Varangians. Knights on heavy war horses charged them. Raffen and the men around him formed a wall of shields and axes. The first charge hit them like a wave hitting a rock. Horses screamed, men fell, the axes rose and fell. They were not fighting a clever battle, they were just fighting. They drove the knights back. Guiscard's wife, Sichelgaita, a warrior herself, rode up and rallied the Normans, calling them cowards. They charged again and again. Raffen felt a blow to his shield that numbed his arm. A man beside him went down, a spear in his throat. He stepped over the body, his world shrinking to the man in front of him, the weight of his axe, the feel of the ground under his feet. Well, he was no longer fighting for Alexios, he was no longer fighting for gold. He was fighting because the man on his left was his friend from Bergen, and the man on his right had shared his bread that morning. They were the guard. They did not run. They pushed forward in a furious counterattack. They drove the Norman knights back all the way to the water's edge. For a moment, it seemed they might turn the tide of the whole battle by themselves. They were a small island of order in a sea of chaos. But they were alone. Guiscard saw his chance. He sent his spearmen and crossbowmen to surround them. Arrows rained down. Spears jabbed from all sides. They were cut off. They took refuge in a small church nearby. They barred the doors. The Normans brought wood and brush. They set the church on fire. Inside, the air grew thick with smoke. The heat was unbearable. Raffen could hear the wood crackling. He could hear the Normans shouting outside. Some men were coughing, their eyes streaming. They could have surrendered. They were mercenaries. Their employer had fled the field. Their contract was, in a sense, broken. But no one spoke of it. They were the Varangian Guard. They had been given a post, and they had held it. This was the end of that post. Raffen gripped his axe. He said a prayer to a god he hadn't thought of in years. He and the other survivors stayed in the burning church. They chose the fire over surrender. The secret they took with them was simple. Their final loyalty wasn't to the gold or the emperor. It was to the shield wall itself. It was to each other. They did not break. Number 16, the first oath was not to the emperor. His name was Styrkar. He came from a small fjord in western Norway. He arrived in Constantinople in the year 1050. He was barely 20. He had come on a trading ship working his passage. He had nothing but the clothes he wore, a rusty sword, and a desire to not be a poor farmer like his father. He found the barracks of the Varangian Guard. They were not what he expected. It was a city within a city. A loud, boisterous place that smelled of sweat, forge smoke, and foreign spices. Men from Sweden, Denmark, Iceland, and Rus all lived together. He presented himself to a grizzled veteran whose face was a map of old scars. The man looked him up and down. Though he tested Styrkar's strength, he made him swing a heavy two-handed axe until his arms burned. He was accepted. He thought that was it. He thought he would now go before a Byzantine official, swear an oath to the Emperor Constantine the Ninth Monomachos, and be given his gear. That happened later. The first oath, the real one, came that night. He was taken to a dark, torch-lit room deep within the barracks. There were no Byzantines present, only a dozen senior Varangians. They were the heart of the guard. The commander, a man they called Kolskegger, stood before him. He was a giant of a man, an Icelander who had served for 30 years. He did not speak in Greek. He spoke in Old Norse, the language of home. Kolskegger held no holy book. He held no imperial standard. He held a single polished axe. He told Styrkar that he would soon swear a public oath to the emperor. He would promise to defend him with his life. He would promise to be loyal to the Roman Empire. That was for the Greeks. That was for the paymasters. But tonight he would swear a different oath, the Varangian oath. Kolskegger said that his first loyalty was to the man on his right and the man on his left. In the shield wall, they were one body. If one man's shield broke, the man next to him would cover him. If one man fell, the man behind him would take his place. He swore that he would never willingly abandon a fellow Varangian on the battlefield, alive or dead. Their bodies must be recovered if possible. Their share of any plunder must be given to their family if they had one. He swore to never bring the squabbles of the outside world into the barracks. In this place, a Swede did not hate a Dane. A Norwegian did not mock an Icelander. They were no longer of those places. They were Varangians. He swore to never cheat a brother guard in trade or gambling. A man's word inside the barracks was his bond, and the final part of the oath was the most important. He swore to uphold the reputation of the guard. He was told that they were not just mercenaries, they were the emperor's men. They were trusted because they were foreigners with no stake in Byzantine politics. They were trusted because they were honest. If a Varangian was tasked to guard a treasury, not a single coin would go missing. If he was tasked to guard a prisoner, that prisoner would not escape. This trust was their most valuable asset. It was worth more than gold. To betray, it was to betray every man in the room. And there was no ceremony. Styrkar just had to look Kolskegger in the eye and give his word. He said, "I swear it." That was all, there was no record of this oath in the imperial archives. No Greek scribe wrote it down. It was a secret kept in the heart of the barracks. It was an understanding between men far from home. The public oath made them soldiers of the empire, but this quiet, unwritten oath made them brothers. It was the glue that held the guard together. It explained why they would stand and die on a lost field like Dyrrhachium long after their employer had fled. They were fighting for something more than a contract. On number 15, we blinded an emperor and never spoke of how it felt. His name was Gunnar. He was from the Swedish island of Gotland. He joined the Guard in 1040 during the reign of Michael IV. He had served alongside the famous Harold Hardrada. He liked Harold. He was a leader who bled with his men. In April of 1042, everything in Constantinople exploded. Michael IV had died, and his nephew, Michael V, took the throne. The new emperor was arrogant. He quickly made an enemy of the powerful Empress Zoe, whom the people loved. He had her arrested and exiled to a monastery. It was a mistake. The people of Constantinople rioted. The city was in chaos. The palace was a fortress, and the Varangian guard were the keepers of the gate. Gunnar stood on the walls and watched the city burn. He and his comrades were the only thing keeping the mob from the emperor. For 2 days, they held the line. They were loyal, that was their job, but things were changing inside the palace. The court officials, the eunuchs, the nobles, they could feel which way the wind was blowing. Michael V was losing. The city demanded the return of Empress Zoe. On the third day, the political tide turned completely. The nobles in the palace turned on Michael V. They declared him deposed. They sided with the mob and the empress. Suddenly, the Varangians had new orders. Their employer was no longer Michael V. Their employer was now the state, and the state had chosen Empress Zoe. Their loyalty had to switch in an instant. There was no time for debate. Michael V and his uncle, the most powerful eunuch in the court, fled. They took refuge in the monastery of Staudian. They sought sanctuary. The new rulers in the palace wanted to make sure Michael V could never threaten them again. And an order was given. It was passed to the commander of the Varangians. It was a common punishment for deposed emperors and political rivals in Byzantium. It was meant to disqualify them from rule without killing them. The order was to blind Michael V and his uncle, and Gunnar was part of the squad sent to do it. He, along with Harald Hardrada, marched to the monastery. They found the former emperor clinging to the altar. He was no longer a powerful ruler. He was just a terrified young man. He begged for his life. He pleaded for mercy. The Varangians were soldiers. They were used to killing men in battle. That was clean. That had a kind of honor to it. This was different. This was not combat. It was a cold political act. The man was helpless. The official who gave the order was a Byzantine, but he would not do the work himself. He ordered the Varangians to do it. They were the tools. They were the foreigners who could be trusted to carry out an ugly command without question. Gunnar never told anyone back home the details of what happened in that church. The sagas written about Harald Hardrada mention it briefly, almost as a boast, or Harald blinded the emperor, but they don't say how it felt. Gunnar knew. He remembered the smell of the incense in the church. He remembered the man's screams. He remembered the cold feeling in his own stomach. They did the job they were paid to do. They followed their new orders. They secured the throne for the new rulers. When they returned to the barracks, no one spoke of it. They cleaned their gear, they ate their meal, life went on. But something had changed. They had seen the true face of Byzantine power. It wasn't just about glorious battles and parades. It was about this quiet, grim work in a holy place. Gunnar understood then that their loyalty was a weapon, and the Byzantines would use it for any purpose they saw fit. The secret was not the act itself. The whole city knew what had happened. The secret was the shame of it. The feeling of being a butcher, not a warrior. And that was a secret you kept to yourself. You buried it deep and never spoke its name. Number 14, the loneliest place in the world was the Emperor's bedroom. Eric was a Dane. He was unusually quiet for a Varangian. He wasn't one for the loud boasting and drinking in the barracks, but he was steady, rock solid. And that was why he was often chosen for the most sensitive duty of all the night watch inside the Emperor's personal chambers in the Great Palace. This was a post of immense trust. He was one of a handful of men, the Akaluthos, who followed the Emperor everywhere. The palace was a labyrinth of marble corridors, silk hangings, and golden mosaics. During the day, it was a hive of activity. Their courtiers schemed in whispers. Servants hurried past. Priests chanted in the chapels. But at night, it was different. At night, the palace became a tomb. It was silent. A deep, heavy silence that was completely unnatural for a man used to the wind and the sea. Eric's post was just outside the Emperor's bedchamber. He stood for hours, his axe resting on his shoulder. He could not sit. He could not speak unless spoken to. His only job was to be a silent, immovable wall of Nordic muscle and steel. He was guarding the most powerful man in the world, and it was the most boring job he had ever had, but it was also terrifying. The silence was full of ghosts. He would hear the skittering of a mouse, and his hand would tighten on his axe. He would see a shadow move as a cloud passed over the moon, and his heart would pound. He was not afraid of a frontal assault. 100 men charging the door would be a relief. He was afraid of the single, silent figure with a poisoned needle. The quiet assassin who knew a secret way through the walls. The court was full of intrigue. Every smiling noble who bowed to the emperor during the day was a potential killer at night. He learned the sounds of the palace at night. The groaning of the ancient building. The sigh of the wind through a high window. The distant cry of a peacock in the gardens. He learned the breathing patterns of the emperor sleeping behind the thick wooden door. A cough, a mumble in a dream. These were the only signs that the man he was guarding was still alive. And there were the private moments. Eric saw things no historian would ever record. He saw the emperor, a man who was almost a god to his people, weep after receiving bad news from the frontier. He saw him argue bitterly with his wife, the Empress. He saw him shuffling through his chambers in his nightclothes, looking old and frail, not like the divine figure on the coins. He saw the humanity, the fear, and the weakness behind the imperial mask. He could never speak of these things. To even hint at them would be treason. It was a knowledge that isolated him. His comrades in the barracks would talk of battles, of women, of the gold they were earning. Eric could not share his experiences. He could not say, "Today I watched the Emperor throw a priceless vase at the wall because the Seljuks took another town." This knowledge was a burden. The secret was the profound loneliness of that duty. He was closer to the center of power than any senator or general, yet he was completely invisible. He was a piece of furniture that carried an axe. He was the protector of a man's life, but could never know the man. And he learned that the true heart of the empire was not a throne of gold, but a quiet, lonely room where a man slept fitfully, dreaming of the enemies both outside and inside his walls. And the only thing standing between him and the darkness was another lonely man, a foreigner from the north, listening to the silence. Number 13, some of us never came home, and it wasn't because we died. His name was Ulf. He came from the Malaren Valley in Sweden. He arrived in Miklagard in the 1060s, a young man hungry for silver. For 15 years he served the emperor. He fought in the Balkans. He fought in Anatolia. He was a good soldier. He sent money home. His family bought more land. They carved a runestone in his honor, telling of his deeds in the East. They expected him to come home one day, a rich and famous man, and live out his days as a local chieftain. Ulf never came home. But he didn't die in battle, he didn't die of disease, he just stayed. When Ulf first arrived, he saw the Byzantines as strange. They were small and dark, they talked too much, their religion was full of smoke and chanting he didn't understand. And he lived in the Varangian barracks, a little piece of the north transplanted to the south. He spoke Norse with his friends. He drank heavily. He held to the old ways as much as he could. But 15 years is a long time. Slowly, things changed. He learned Greek. At first, it was just enough to buy food in the market, to understand basic orders. But then he started to understand the jokes. He started to appreciate the wordplay. He found himself thinking in Greek sometimes. He was stationed for a year as part of the guard for a wealthy monastery on the outskirts of the city. He would talk to the monks. They were educated men. They told him stories, not of Odin and Thor, but of saints and martyrs. They spoke of a god who offered forgiveness, not a glorious death in battle. It was strange, but it was also compelling. He began attending their services, standing in the back, watching the icons glitter in the candlelight. He met a woman. Her name was Eudokia. Her father was a merchant who sold supplies to the barracks. She was nothing like the women back home. She was quiet and graceful. She taught him more about the city, about her faith. He fell in love. Her family would never let her marry a barbarian mercenary who worshipped pagan gods. So Ulf made a choice. He was baptized. He took a new name, Michael. He was no longer Ulf. He formally converted to Orthodox Christianity. He married Eudokia. With the money he had saved, he bought a partnership in her father's business. He left the guard. His old Varangian comrades didn't understand. They saw it as a betrayal. He had gone Greek. He stopped coming to the barracks to drink. His Norse felt rusty. His new life was in the busy commercial streets of Constantinople, not in the shield wall. He had a wife and soon children. His children were Byzantines. They spoke Greek. They went to church. They would never know the feel of a Swedish winter. He thought about home sometimes. He missed the smell of the pine forests. He missed the long, bright summer nights. But what would he do there? He was a different man now. He was Michael, the merchant. He couldn't go back to being Ulf, the farmer's son. His old life was a story he told his children sometimes, like a fairy tale. The secret was that the great city could conquer a man in ways an army never could. It didn't just buy your axe, it could buy your soul. For every runestone in Sweden that spoke of a man who died bravely in Greece, there were men like Ulf, or men who were lost to their families not because of a sword, but because they found a new home. They chose a new god. They built a new life, and this quiet, personal surrender was a fate the sagas rarely bothered to record. Number 12. The axe was not a brute's weapon. Everyone thought they knew the Varangian axe. They saw a giant Norseman screaming a battle cry, swinging a massive blade in a wild arc. They thought it was all about brute strength. They were wrong. The secret of the Danish axe was that it was a dancer's weapon, not a lumberjack's tool. Ragnar was a weapons master in the guard in the early 11th century. It was his job to train the new arrivals, the farm boys who thought swinging an axe was just a matter of muscle. He would take them into the training yard, a dusty patch of ground behind the barracks. He would watch them try to swing the heavy, long-handled axes. They were clumsy, they were slow, they left themselves wide open. Ragnar would stop them. He would take an axe himself. The one he used for training had a blunted edge, but the weight was the same. "You are not chopping wood," he would tell them in his gruff Norse. "You are carving a man." He taught them the first lesson the axe was not a one-handed weapon. It required both hands, and the power came not from the arms, but from the hips. It was a full-body movement, a twist and a release, like a farmer sowing seed. This generated incredible momentum. The trick was not just to swing hard, but to control that momentum. A missed swing could throw a man off balance, and an off-balance man was a dead man. He taught them the different guards and stances, how to hold the axe at a ready position, the head angled down, using the long haft to parry a sword thrust. He showed them how to use the bottom of the handle to strike an opponent's face, a quick, surprising jab that could create an opening. The true secret, though, was in the versatility of the axe head itself. It wasn't just a blade. The top point of the axe, the two, was sharpened. Ragnar taught them how to use it in a thrusting motion like a short spear to get past a shield. The bottom point, the heel or beard, was a hook. This was the most important part. He would set up a practice dummy with a shield. He showed the recruits how to swing the axe just over the top of the shield, then drag it down. The beard would catch the shield's edge and pull it down, exposing the man behind it for a fraction of a second. In that fraction of a second, the man would die. He taught them how to hook a leg, pulling an opponent off his feet. He taught them how to hook the back of a neck. He taught them how to fight in the tight press of the shield wall. There was no room for wide, heroic swings. It was short, brutal work. Quick thrusts with the toe, pulling down shields with the beard. Short, sharp chops at exposed limbs. It was a gruesome education. It was about geometry and leverage, not just rage. A trained Varangian didn't just swing his axe, he guided it. He let the weight of the weapon do the work. He knew that a single, well-placed strike was better than 10 wild swings. He was precise, he was efficient. Opposing soldiers who faced the guard for the first time expected a wild charge of berserkers. Instead, they faced a disciplined wall of men who used their fearsome axes with a terrifying, almost surgical precision. They didn't just hack. They dismantled their enemies. They broke their shield walls, crippled their stances, and then delivered the final blow. The secret Ragnar taught was that the axe was not a weapon of rage. It was a weapon of cold, hard physics. And in the hands of a master, it was an instrument of brutal artistry. Number 11, our real job was policing the powerful. Constantine was from Rus, a man from the city of Novgorod. He came to Constantinople not just for the money, but for the order of it. In his homeland, power came from the strongest chieftain, the sharpest sword. Here, there was law. Or so he thought. He joined the guard around 1075 during the troubled reign of Michael VII Ducas. He quickly learned that the Varangians were not just soldiers for foreign wars. Their most common and most dangerous duty was keeping the peace within the city itself. This did not mean chasing common thieves. The city had its own watch for that. The Varangians were the emperor's fist. They were called upon when the situation was too delicate or too dangerous for anyone else. Their main job was policing the rich and powerful. One evening, Constantine and his unit were called out. There was no foreign army at the gates. The trouble was at the mansion of a powerful nobleman, a man named Bardas. Bardas was from one of the great Anatolian families, and he was angry. He had been passed over for a promotion at court. As a protest, he had barricaded himself in his city residence with his private army of retainers, 100 armed men. He was defying the emperor. The city watch was powerless. The captain of the watch was a cousin of Bardas's wife. He wasn't going to start a private war with a great family. The regular army, the Tagmata, were also hesitant. Their generals were connected by marriage and politics to men like Bardas. To move against him could trigger a civil war. So the emperor sent the Varangians. They had no family connections in the city. They had no political allegiances. Their loyalty was to their paymaster, the emperor. That was their great strength. They were immune to the web of Byzantine intrigue. Constantine and his comrades marched through the streets. People watched them pass in silence. The sight of the Varangians on the move meant that serious trouble was afoot. They arrived at the mansion. It was a fortress. Men with bows stood on the roof. The gates were barred. Their commander did not try to negotiate. He simply shouted their terms in broken Greek. "In the emperor's name, open the gates." A voice from the walls shouted back, "A refusal? An insult." The Varangian commander turned to his men. He gave a single command, "Break it down." Constantine put his shoulder next to a dozen others against a heavy log they had carried with them. They smashed it against the gate. Wood splintered. They hit it again and again. Arrows rained down from the roof, clattering off their helmets and shields. A man next to Constantine grunted and fell, an arrow in his thigh. They ignored him. The medics would get him later. Their job was the gate. It finally burst open. They poured into the courtyard. Bardas's retainers were waiting for them. It was a chaotic, ugly brawl, not a clean battle in an open field. This was fighting in a confined space against men who were not foreign enemies, but subjects of the same emperor. But an order was an order. They were brutally efficient. They were better trained, better disciplined. They pushed the retainers back into the main house. They found Bardas in the main hall, surrounded by his bodyguards. He was a proud man in fine silks, holding a sword he barely knew how to use. He looked at the Varangians, their faces grim, their axes splattered with the blood of his own men. He saw no hesitation in their eyes. He saw no room for negotiation. These were not men you could bribe or threaten with political ruin. They were a force of nature. He dropped his sword. They took him into custody. The affair was over. They had enforced the emperor's will. The secret Constantine learned that day was that the Varangian guards' true value was not just their strength in battle. It was their otherness. They were the one tool the emperor had that could not be corrupted by the city's endless games of power and influence. They were the outsiders, and that was precisely what made them the ultimate insiders, the enforcers of a law that no one else was willing or able to apply to the powerful. Number 10. The Emperor called me by my name. His name was Kolskegger. He was from a powerful family in Iceland, but a blood feud had forced him to leave home. He arrived in Constantinople around 1045 and served for nearly 4 decades. He saw emperors come and go. He saw the great defeat at Manzikert. He saw the empire shrink and tremble. By the time Alexios the Komnenos came to the throne in 1081, Kolskegger was an old man by Varangian standards. He was the commander of the guard, the Akaluthos. He was a living legend. Most Varangians saw the emperor from a distance. He was a remote figure in purple robes, surrounded by ceremony, but Kolskegger was different. As commander, he was part of the emperor's inner circle. He attended council meetings, not to speak, but to stand guard behind the emperor's chair. He was the silent presence that guaranteed the emperor's safety. Alexios was a different kind of emperor. He was a soldier. He understood fighting men. He did not treat Kolskegger like a piece of furniture. He spoke to him. At first, it was just questions about the state of the guard, about the new recruits, but it grew into something more. One night, after a long and disastrous council meeting where the nobles had argued and schemed while the Turks advanced, Alexios dismissed everyone except Kolskegger. The emperor looked exhausted. He slumped in his throne. He turned to the old Varangian. "What do you think, Kolskegger?" he asked in Greek. Am I mad to try and hold this all together?" Kolskegger was shocked. The emperor was asking for his opinion. He was a mercenary, a barbarian. He was paid to swing an axe, not to give political advice. He stood silent for a moment. Then he answered, in his heavily accented Greek, "You are the emperor," he said simply. "You do not have the choice to stop." Alexios smiled a little. It was a simple, honest answer. It was not the flattery he got from his courtiers. From that day on, their relationship changed. Alexios would often keep Kolskegger behind after meetings. He would talk to the old Icelander about his plans, his fears, his frustrations with the treacherous nobility. You know, he didn't want advice, he just wanted someone to talk to who was not trying to manipulate him. Someone whose only loyalty was to him. And Kolskegger became the emperor's confidant. He guarded the emperor's secrets, not just his body. He knew which generals Alexios secretly distrusted. He knew about the emperor's desperate plans to raise money. He knew about the quiet grief Alexios felt for the state of the empire. He was trusted with a knowledge far more dangerous than any state secret. He was trusted with the emperor's humanity. The Byzantine princess and historian Anna Komnene wrote about Kolskegger. She mentioned his loyalty to her father. She noted that after one battle, Alexios asked Kolskegger to sit with him in his tent, a great honor. But she couldn't know the depth of their bond. The secret was the strange, lonely friendship between the weary, sophisticated emperor and the old, straightforward Viking. It was a relationship that defied all the strict rules of the Byzantine court. Kolskegger never forgot he was a servant. But Alexios, in those quiet moments, treated him like a friend. Kolskegger never recorded this. He never boasted about it in the barracks. It was a private honor. The ultimate sign of trust was not being given command in a great battle. It was the moment when the most powerful man in the world turned to you in the quiet of a lonely room and called you by your name, asking for nothing more than a moment of unvarnished truth. Number 9, we had our own banking system. Sven was from Denmark. He was a younger son with no inheritance. He joined the Guard in the 990s during the reign of the great Basil II, the Bulgar Slayer. The pay was excellent. A regular soldier received a monthly salary in gold numisma coins. There were also bonuses, donatives given out on the accession of a new emperor or on major holidays. And then there was the plunder. After a successful campaign in Bulgaria, Sven found himself with a small fortune. He had a bag of gold coins, some silver goblets, and a fine silk cloak. He was rich, but his riches were also a problem. What was he to do with them? The barracks were full of gamblers and thieves. Carrying all his wealth on him was dangerous. He wanted to send it home to his family, to buy land, to secure his future. But how? There were no banks like we know them today. He could entrust his gold to a Greek merchant, but he didn't trust them. They saw the Varangians as rich, stupid barbarians ripe for cheating. The secret system the Varangians developed was built on the only thing they did, trust the vast network of Scandinavian trade routes and the word of their own people. The system worked through men they called ship masters. These were the captains of the Rus trading vessels that plied the great river route from the Baltic down the Dnieper to the Black Sea and Constantinople. These men were well known, and their families were powerful merchants in places like Kiev, Novgorod, or the Swedish trading post of Birka. Sven would go to a specific tavern near the harbor, a place frequented by Norse traders. There he would find a shipmaster he knew by reputation, a man named Ivar from Gotland. Sven would hand over his gold. He would not get a written receipt. That was a Greek affectation. The deal was sealed with a handshake and a drink. Well, Ivar would take the gold. He would also take a message from Sven to his family in Denmark. He would sometimes take a unique item, a specific carved ring that would prove the message was from Sven. And Ivar would then sail north. He would go to Kiev. There he would not be carrying Sven's actual gold coins. That was too risky. Instead, he would use the gold in Constantinople to buy goods the Rus desperately wanted: fine Byzantine silks, wine, glassware, spices. These were high-value, high-demand trade goods. He would transport these goods north. In Kiev or Novgorod, he would sell them for a great profit, for silver bars or Arab dirhams, the common currency of the Rus. From there, the network spread out. Another trader, a kinsman of Ivar, would take the equivalent value in silver and travel the Baltic trade routes. He would eventually arrive at a port in Denmark near Sven's home. He would find Sven's brother. He would deliver the message, the carved ring, and the silver. The system was slow. It could take a year or more for a man's wealth to reach his home. It was built entirely on reputation and kinship. If Ivar cheated Sven, his name would be mud. No Varangian would ever trade with him again. His reputation, his family's honor, was his bond. This informal banking system was one of the Guard's most important secrets. It was how they funneled the wealth of the Byzantine Empire into the Scandinavian and Rus homelands. It transformed the economies of their home villages, it built churches and bought farms, and it was all done without a single piece of paper, without a single Greek lawyer. It was a system of trust that ran along the keel marks of longships, a river of gold that flowed north, managed by the unwritten laws of the Rus and the Norsemen. Number 8, we knew the shame of Manzikert before the Emperor did. His name was Bjorn. He was a veteran from Norway. He stood in the second rank of the Varangian Guard on a hot, dusty plain in eastern Anatolia in August of 1071. The place was called Manzikert. The Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes was determined to drive the Seljuk Turks out of his lands for good. He had assembled a huge army. It was a mix of native Byzantine troops, mercenaries from all over, and at its core, the Varangian Guard. The feeling before the battle was wrong. The army was too big, too unwieldy. The generals were squabbling. Well, the emperor's chief rival, Andronikos Doukas, commanded the rear guard. Bjorn and the other old hands felt it in their bones. The army was sick from the inside. The battle started well. The imperial center with the Varangians in the vanguard pushed the Seljuk forces back. The Turks, mostly horse archers, refused a straight fight. They skirmished, they retreated, they fired arrows. It was frustrating, like fighting a swarm of bees. Late in the day, Emperor Romanos, thinking the Seljuk Sultan had fled, ordered a return to camp. It was a complex maneuver for a large army. This was the moment the Turks had been waiting for. As the Byzantine lines turned, the Turks swept in from the flanks. Then came the betrayal. The rear guard under Andronikos Doukas was supposed to move up and cover the retreat. Instead, Doukas spread a rumor that the emperor had fallen. He turned his forces around and marched away from the battle. He deliberately abandoned the rest of the army. Bjorn saw it happen. He saw the banners of the rear guard turn and leave. He and the men around him knew what it meant. They were trapped. Panic ripped through the mercenary wings of the army. They broke and fled. Suddenly, the imperial center was alone, surrounded. The Varangians did what they always did. They formed a ring around the emperor. The sun was setting. The air was thick with dust and arrows. The Turks closed in. Bjorn's world became a small circle of chaos. Shield up, parry, chop with the axe. A man next to him fell. He stepped into the gap. He could hear the emperor shouting orders, trying to keep the men together. Romanos was a brave man, fighting like a common soldier. But bravery was not enough. They were overwhelmed. Bjorn took a cut to his leg. He saw the emperor's horse go down. He saw the emperor wounded, surrounded. The fight went out of them then. Their purpose was gone. The man they were sworn to protect was captured. A few Varangians, Bjorn among them, managed to cut their way out in the darkness and confusion. They were a broken remnant. They fled the field. They were the first to carry the news of the disaster, not to the capital, but to the rest of the scattered army. The secret they carried was not just that the battle was lost. The official story, when it eventually reached the capital, would be one of heroic resistance against overwhelming odds. The secret Bjorn and the other survivors carried was the truth. The battle was not lost to the Turks. It was lost to Byzantine treachery. They had been betrayed from within. They had stood and died, not for a glorious empire, but for a rotten court that was eating itself alive. They knew the shame of it first. The shame of watching their emperor captured, the shame of running from a battle, and the deepest shame of all, the knowledge that their loyalty and their blood had been spent for nothing, thrown away in a political game they could never understand. When they finally limped back to Constantinople, they kept that part of the story to themselves. They were soldiers. They did not talk of politics, they just spoke of the dead. Number 7. A shield brother's life was worth more than the emperor's gold. The year was 1014, the Guard was on campaign in the mountains of Bulgaria. Basil II was the emperor, and he was waging a relentless war to crush the Bulgarian Empire. The fighting was brutal. It was a war of ambushes in narrow mountain passes, of fortified towns, of grim sieges. Two Varangians, Hakon and Leif, were inseparable. They had come from the same village in Norway. They had joined the Guard together. In the shield wall, they always stood side by side. They were shield brothers, a bond deeper than friendship. During the Battle of Kleidion, the Byzantine army trapped the main Bulgarian force in a pass. The Varangians were tasked with the main assault to break the wooden fortifications the Bulgarians had built. It was a bloody, head-on attack. Hakon and Leif were in the first wave. They hacked their way through the palisade. Inside, the fighting was a confused melee. A Bulgarian warrior, a giant of a man, swung a heavy sword at Hakon. Hakon blocked it with his shield, but the force of the blow shattered the wood and sent him stumbling back. He was off balance, his shield arm numb. The Bulgarian raised his sword for the killing blow. Leif saw it happen. He was fighting his own opponent, but he disengaged without a second thought. He took 2 quick steps and threw himself in front of Hakon. Leif's shield took the blow that was meant for his friend. The sword bit deep into the shield, but it held. Leif grunted from the impact. That moment was all Hakon needed. He recovered, roared, and swung his axe, cutting the Bulgarian down. They had no time to speak. The battle raged around them. They reformed side by side and continued the fight. Later that day, the battle was won. The Byzantine victory was absolute. Emperor Basil ordered that the thousands of Bulgarian prisoners be blinded. It was a horrifying act of state policy meant to break the spirit of the Bulgarian people. The Varangians were the ones who had to guard the prisoners while the grim work was done. They saw the full brutality of their employer. After the campaign, Basil II was generous. He rewarded his soldiers handsomely. The Varangians, who had borne the brunt of the fighting, received the largest share. Leif was given a bonus, an extra bag of gold coins, for an act of bravery in the battle. An officer had seen him shield Hakon. That night, in the camp, Leif took the bag of gold. He walked over to where Hakon was sitting, oiling his axe. He tossed the bag into Hakon's lap. Hakon looked up, confused. "What's this?" "It's yours," Leif said. "No, it's not. This is the Emperor's bonus. It was given to you." Leif shrugged. "They gave it to me for saving your life. That means your life has a price. It's worth 1 bag of gold. I don't think so. Your life is not for sale. So you take the gold. We'll call it even." Hakon tried to argue, but Leif was stubborn. He would not take the money. It was a matter of principle. You didn't save your shield brother for a reward. You did it because he was your shield brother. To accept money for it would be to cheapen the act, to make it a transaction. The secret was this unwritten code. The bond between the men was not something that could be measured in Byzantine gold. They fought for the emperor, yes, they served for the pay, but they died for each other. An act of loyalty to a comrade was not an act of service to the empire. It was something separate, something personal. It belonged to a different, older world of oaths and honor that the Byzantines could never fully understand. Leif never mentioned the incident. Again, the gold was spent, but the real value was in the act itself, a debt that could never and should never be repaid. Number 6, the Pechenegs taught us a new kind of fear. His name was Ivar. He was a Swede from a farm near the Great Lake. He was big and strong, and he thought he was invincible. He had joined the Guard in the 1080s. He had trained hard. He knew how to use his axe. He knew how to stand in a shield wall. He felt ready for anything. Then he was sent to the northern frontier along the Danube, and he met the Pecheneg. The Pechenegs were a nomadic people from the steppes. They were horsemen. They lived and died in the saddle. Or they did not fight like anyone Ivar had ever imagined. The Varangians were trained for a certain kind of war. A clash of infantry lines, a shield wall against another shield wall, a steady, grinding advance. The Pechenegs did not play that game. They came in a great swarm, hundreds, thousands of them, on small, tough ponies. They did not charge the Varangian line. They circled it. They stayed just out of reach of a thrown spear. They held their bows sideways in the steppe fashion. They fired clouds of arrows. It was a nightmare. There was no enemy to hit. There was nothing to charge. No Ivar and his comrades just had to stand there, shield to shield, and endure the storm of arrows. The sound was a constant, terrifying hiss, followed by the thud of arrows hitting shields, helmets, and flesh. Men would grunt and fall with no enemy soldier even within reach. Then, just as suddenly as they appeared, the Pechenegs would vanish. They would ride back over the horizon. The Varangians would be left standing among their dead and wounded, having never swung their axes at a single foe. The medics would be busy. The survivors would spend hours pulling arrows out of their shields. The worst part was the waiting. They would ride for days across the flat, empty plains of the Balkans, and then, without warning, the Pechenegs would be there again, a dark line on the horizon. They would come from all sides at once. They would use their famous tactic of the feigned retreat. A group would charge, then break and flee as if in panic. A new, inexperienced unit of Byzantine cavalry might give chase. It was a trap. The fleeing Pechenegs would turn in their saddles and fire arrows backwards. The main body of their force would be waiting over the next hill to ambush and destroy the pursuers. Ivar learned a new kind of fear. It wasn't the hot-blooded fear of a melee where you could fight back. It was a cold, grinding fear. It was the fear of helplessness. His great strength meant nothing. His heavy axe was useless. He was just a target. He also learned a grudging respect. The Pechenegs were masters of their world. Their skill on horseback was incredible. They could pick up a fallen weapon from the ground at a full gallop. They were tough. They could live for weeks on the open steppe with almost no supplies. The secret the Varangians learned from fighting the Pechenegs was humility. They were the elite, the best heavy infantry in the world, but on these vast open plains, their way of war was obsolete. They learned that there were enemies you couldn't just crush with brute force. You had to adapt. Under Emperor Alexios I, the Byzantine army, including the Varangians, started to change. They learned to use their own light cavalry, their own archers. They learned not to chase a retreating foe. But for Ivar, the lesson was personal. He never again felt invincible. He had seen a kind of warfare that was like fighting the wind. It taught him that the world was bigger and stranger than he had ever imagined on his Swedish farm. And that true courage wasn't about charging the enemy, but sometimes it was about just standing still and enduring a storm you could not fight. Number 5, the rules of plunder were simple: don't get caught. The official term was Pollutisvarf. It was a right granted to the Varangian Guard. After a city was captured or a rebel was defeated, the Varangians were allowed to enter the palace or headquarters of the vanquished leader and take whatever they could carry. It was a major part of their compensation. It was what made men rich. Tryggva was a young Norwegian who joined in 1038. He was part of Harald Hardrada's contingent. He was on the campaign in Sicily under the general George Maniax. When the city of Syracuse was taken from its Arab rulers, the word was given. The Varangians were unleashed on the ruler's palace. It was chaos, a mad rush of big men and mail, grabbing everything that wasn't nailed down. Gold plates, silver cups, silk hangings, jeweled daggers, bags of coins. Tryggva was overwhelmed. He managed to get a few silver items and a small chest of coins. He saw Harald Hardrada and his closest men systematically stripping the treasury. They were organized, they knew what they were doing, but there was a secret, unwritten rule. The Pollutisvarf only applied to the defeated enemy. You did not, under any circumstances, steal from the Byzantine Empire or its citizens. The guards' reputation for honesty was absolute. They were often used to transport tax revenues or guard the imperial treasury, precisely because they were considered incorruptible. The temptation was enormous. The Varangians were surrounded by a wealth they could only dream of. They guarded storehouses filled with gold. They escorted officials carrying huge sums of money, and they were paid a salary that, while good, was a pittance compared to the wealth they were protecting. A few years later, Tryggve was on a different mission. He was part of a unit escorting a tax shipment from a province in Greece back to Constantinople. It was a train of mules laden with chests of gold and silver coins. They were camped for the night. The Byzantine official in charge was asleep in his tent. The two Varangians on watch were friends of Tryggve. Their names were Finn and Kjetil. Tryggve saw them talking in low voices, looking at the chests. He knew what they were thinking. It would be so easy. A few handfuls of coins from each chest. Who would know? The amounts were so vast, no one would ever miss it. They could blame it on bandits. They could be rich overnight. Tryggve walked over to them. He didn't say anything. He just stood there and looked at them. He remembered the look of cold fury on his commander's face once when a recruit was caught stealing wine from a monastery they were supposed to be protecting. The man wasn't just flogged. He was dismissed from the guard in disgrace. He was cast out. He lost everything. His name was blackened among all the Norsemen in the city. Finn and Kjetil saw the look in Tryggve's eyes. They knew he wouldn't report them. That wasn't the Varangian way, but they also knew he would never trust them again. They would be outcasts within the Brotherhood. Their word would be worthless. They looked away, ashamed. They went back to their posts. The subject was never mentioned. The tax shipment arrived in Constantinople with every coin accounted for. The secret was not that Varangians didn't steal. The secret was the brutal internal policing they applied to themselves. The official punishment from the Byzantines for theft was harsh, but the unofficial punishment from their own comrades was worse. It was the loss of trust. It was the shunning. In a band of brothers far from home, that was a kind of death. They maintained their reputation for honesty, not just out of a sense of abstract duty to the emperor, but out of a fierce practical need to trust the man standing next to them. The plunder of an enemy was a right of war. The plunder of your employer was a betrayal of everyone in the guard, and that was a crime they punished themselves. Number 4, the journey to the great city was the first and hardest battle. Before a man could become a Varangian, he had to get to Constantinople. This journey was an ordeal that broke many before they ever saw the Golden Horn. It was a rite of passage, an unrecorded battle against distance, hunger, and danger. Olaf was the son of a farmer from the coast of Norway. It was the year 988. He had heard the stories from a trader who had come back from Miklagard, stories of gold, of a city with walls so high they touched the clouds. He decided he would go. He was 18, he had a small axe, a leather tunic, and a few dried fish. He said goodbye to his family. They thought he was mad. He walked from his home fjord across the mountains into Sweden. He followed the rivers and lakes, sometimes getting passage on a small boat, mostly just walking. And he slept in the forest. He hunted and fished for his food. He met other young men like him, drawn by the same dream. They traveled together for safety. The first great challenge was the Baltic Sea. They had to find passage on a trading ship heading east, to the lands of the Rus. They had no money. They paid for their passage with muscle. They rowed. They loaded and unloaded cargo. The sea was rough. One night a storm hit, and Olaf was sure he would die. He saw the coast of what is now Latvia and thought it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. From there, the real journey began. They entered the vast river system of the Rus. They traveled down the Divina or the Lovat. This was a land of thick forests and endless marshes. They had to drag their ships overland from one river system to another. These were the portages. Olaf's back and shoulders ached for weeks. His hands were raw and blistered. The rivers were the highways, but they were not safe. There were rapids. The most famous were on the Dnieper River south of Kiev. Each one had a name. Each one was a death trap of rocks and swirling water. Many ships were lost, many men drowned. Olaf's ship made it through, but only just, and there were people, the local Slavic and Finnic tribes were not always friendly. Sometimes they traded, sometimes they attacked, firing arrows from the riverbanks. And further south, they had to pass through the lands of the Pecheneg nomad. The horsemen would shadow the ships from the shore, waiting for a chance to attack a vessel that got stranded or separated from the convoy. Olaf was hungry all the time. The food they brought with them ran out. They lived on what they could hunt, fish, or trade for. Sometimes they went for days with nothing but a thin gruel. He got sick from bad water. He saw a companion die of a fever, buried in a shallow grave thousands of miles from home. Finally, after months of travel, they reached the Black Sea. Olaf had never seen so much water. It seemed to go on forever. They sailed south, hugging the coast, and then one morning he saw it. The walls of Constantinople, they seemed to rise out of the sea itself. He had made it. He was thin. He was exhausted. He was covered in scars and insect bites. He was no longer the fresh-faced boy who had left his farm. The journey had stripped him down to the bone, but he had survived. He had proven he was tough enough. He was strong enough. The secret was that the Varangian Guard didn't need a harsh training program for new recruits. The journey itself was the training program. It weeded out the weak. It forged the strong. Anyone who could survive the months-long trek from Scandinavia to Miklagard had already proven they had the endurance, the resourcefulness, and the sheer stubborn will to live that the Guard required. The first battle was against the world itself, and only the victors were allowed to enlist. Number 3. We saw blindness used as a weapon, and we kept quiet. The Byzantines had a particular way of dealing with political rivals. In the north, a defeated enemy was usually killed. In Constantinople, power was more refined, and in its own way more cruel. They favored blinding. A blind man could not lead an army. A blind man could not be emperor. It was a way of politically killing a man without actually ending his life. The Varangians, as the emperor's enforcers, were sometimes the instrument of this policy. Thorir was an Icelander, and he was on palace duty in the 1070s. The emperor was Michael VII. The most powerful general in the empire was Nikephoros Bryennios. He was popular with the army. He decided he should be emperor. He rebelled. The man sent to stop him was another general, the future emperor Alexios Komnenos. Alexios defeated Bryennios in battle and captured him. The defeated general was brought to Constantinople. Michael VII and his powerful eunuch minister Nikephoros had to decide what to do with him. An execution might make him a martyr and anger the army. So they chose the traditional way. They ordered him to be blinded. Thorir was part of the guard detail assigned to the task. It was not done in a dark dungeon. It was done clinically in a room in the palace. There was an imperial official present and a physician. Bryennios was a brave man. He was a great soldier. He was held down. Thorir's job was just to stand there, axe in hand, and make sure none of the general's friends tried to intervene. He was a sentinel, a witness. He watched the physician do his work. There was no screaming. The general endured it in silence. But Thorir would never forget the sight. It was not the violence of a battlefield. It was a cold, deliberate act of mutilation. It was the physical manifestation of political power. It was a message to anyone else who thought of rebellion. Thorir and the other Varangians on duty never spoke of it. What was there to say? It was the law of the Romans. It was their custom. It was not for a barbarian mercenary to question, but it changed how he saw his employers. He had come to Miklagard thinking of the Byzantines as sophisticated, civilized, and they were, but their civilization had a dark, cold core. They had refined cruelty into a tool of statecraft. Years later, another general, Nikephoros Basilakes, also rebelled. He too was defeated by Alexios Komnenos. He too was blinded. It was becoming a pattern. The Varangians were the silent, armed witnesses to the systematic destruction of the empire's best military leaders. Each time a great general was blinded, the army was weakened, the empire became more vulnerable to outside enemies like the Turks and the Normans. The Varangians saw this. They were practical men. They understood that you don't destroy your own best warriors. But they were mercenaries. They were paid to obey orders, not to make policy. Their secret was the quiet contempt they felt for this practice. They served an empire that was deliberately crippling itself. They watched as the great families tore each other apart, using the Varangians as their scalpels while the frontiers crumbled. They kept their mouths shut, they took their pay, but they knew. They knew they were guarding a house that was rotting from the inside out, and there was nothing they could do about it. Number 2, the last Varangian guard died in 1453, and he died alone. The Varangian Guard of the Viking Age, the force of Harald Hardrada, was long gone by the 15th century. It had changed. After the English were defeated by the Normans in 1066, a wave of Anglo-Saxon warriors came to Constantinople. They had lost their homes and sought service abroad. For a long time, the Guard became predominantly English. They were known as the Englyn of Arangoi, but by 1453, the Byzantine Empire was a shadow. It was little more than the city of Constantinople itself, surrounded by the vast Ottoman Empire. The Guard was a tiny ceremonial unit, a memory of former glory. His name, we don't know. He might have been English or Scottish. He might have been the descendant of a Norseman who had settled here centuries ago. Let's call him Alfred. He was the commander of what was left of the Varangian Guard. Perhaps 10 men in total. They were a palace guard. Their great axes were polished, but they hadn't been used in a real battle in a generation. Then the siege began. The Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed II, brought a massive army and huge cannons to the walls of Constantinople. The last emperor, Constantine XI Paleologos, had a tiny force to defend a huge city. He called on every able-bodied man. Alfred and his handful of Varangians were there. They were no longer just a palace guard, they were frontline soldiers again. They fought on the great Theodosian walls. They stood beside the emperor, a small band of foreigners, a link to the city's powerful past. They still carried their great axes. Against the Ottoman Janissaries, those axes were fearsome weapons. For 53 days, they held the walls. Alfred fought with the strength of his ancestors. He was no longer a ceremonial guard. He was a Varangian. He was defending his employer. He was defending the city that had been his home. On the 29th of May, 1453, the final assault came. The Janissaries found a small unlocked gate, the Kirka Porta. They poured into the city. At the same time, a massive attack breached the main walls. The defense collapsed. The Emperor Constantine XI knew the end had come. He threw off his purple imperial robes. He fought his last battle as a common soldier near the gate of St. Romanus. According to the histories, he died there, lost in the crush of the final, desperate fight, and fighting with him were the last of his loyal guards. Alfred likely died there too. We can imagine him, his axe rising and falling, a giant among the smaller Greeks and Genoese. He was not fighting for gold. There was no pay left. He was not fighting for a contract. He was fighting for the last emperor of Rome. He was fighting for a dying world. The secret he took to his grave was the final, unspoken thought of the last Varangian. He was the end of a line that stretched back over 500 years, from the first Rus traders who took service with the emperor, through the age of the great Viking heroes, through the era of the dispossessed English. He was the last one. His loyalty was to an idea, an institution that was, breathing its last breath. As he fell, so did the tradition of the Varangian Guard. He died alone, in a sense. The world of his ancestors was gone. The city he served was gone. The emperor he guarded was gone. He was an anachronism, a warrior from an older age making a last stand at the end of the world. And with his death, the long, bloody, glorious story of the Guard came to a final, silent end. Number 1. The hardest secret to keep was the man you became. His name was Thord. He made it home. He left his farm in Iceland in 1090 as a boy of 19. He returned in 1115 as a man of 44. He was rich. He had chests of silver and gold coins. He had silks and spices. He bought a large estate, the one he had dreamed of during long, hot marches in Anatolia. He married. He had children. To his neighbors, he was a great success. He was Thord the Rich, Thord of Miklagard, the man who had gone out into the world and returned a king in all but name. They would gather in his longhouse during the long winter nights. They would ask for stories, and he would tell them. He told them of the great city with its walls and churches covered in gold. He told them of the strange animals in the emperor's menagerie. He told them of the battles against the Turks, of the clash of shield walls, of the great victories. He told them the stories they wanted to hear, the stories of glory, of adventure, of wealth, but he never told them the real stories. He never told them the secrets. He never told them about the quiet fear on the night watch, or the political executions he had to witness. He never told them about the friend who died of dysentery, a slow, ugly death that had none of the glory of battle. He never spoke of the crushing weariness after a month of hard campaigning, the feeling that you could sleep for a year. He couldn't explain the complex Byzantine world he had lived in. How could he describe the power of a court eunuch to men who only measured a man by the strength of his sword arm? How could he explain the subtle theology of the Orthodox Church to people who still half believed in Odin? He had lived in a world of intrigue, of poisons, of spies, of politics so complicated it made a blood feud look like a child's argument. He couldn't put that world into words they would understand, and he couldn't explain how the great city had changed him. He had learned to read a little Greek. He had developed a taste for wine instead of ale. He sometimes found the customs of his own people to be crude and simple. He felt like a stranger in his own home. He looked at the hard, simple life of his neighbors, and a part of him longed for the noise and chaos and beauty of Constantinople. The greatest secret of all was the man he had become. He had left a boy full of simple ideas about honor and gold, and he had come back a man who had seen the world in all its complexity and cruelty. He had served emperors he respected and emperors he despised. He had fought for a cause he didn't always understand. He had been a tool in the hands of powerful men. He had done things he was proud of and things he was deeply ashamed of. He was no longer just Thord the Icelander. A part of him was Varangian. A part of him was, in some strange way, Roman. This new man, this hybrid, was someone his family and friends could never know. They saw the rich warrior. They did not see the man who lay awake at night, the sounds and smells of Constantinople still fresh in his memory, a ghost of a world that no one here could ever comprehend. The final secret the Varangians took to their graves was themselves. They could bring the gold home. They could bring the stories home, but they could never bring home the sum of their experiences. They could never truly explain the life they had lived. They were men caught between two worlds, at home in neither, and that loneliness, the quiet knowledge of a life that could never be fully shared, was the heaviest treasure they carried.